This is video 5 on Locke, and we're going to talk about Locke on substance, this philosophical concept of substance that we've seen already in Descartes and Spinoza. Now we're going to see Locke's take on this. So far with Locke, we've seen his attack on this doctrine of innate ideas. The alternative he presented was that of empiricism, that everything that we come to know comes from sources in sense and reflection. And last time we saw his account of where all these ideas come from. First the simple ideas of sense and the ideas from different senses and the complex ideas that are built out of the simple ideas. And today we're going to talk about this concept of substance, which is obviously central to Locke's account, because he said, when we saw already last time, when he outlines what are the three kinds of complex ideas that we make out of the simple ideas, he says that they are of modes, substances, and relations. And so what we've seen so far are the basics of his empiricism. And I mentioned briefly before that one of the things when we get to his empiricism is that empiricism seems like such a common sense view of knowledge. It seems very down to earth. Why wouldn't you want to be an empiricist? And today we'll start to see some of the reasons why the empiricist outlook might bring problems of its own. Maybe these problems are surmountable. We could have a good account in the end. Nevertheless, when we're trying to build this empiricist view of knowledge, and here we're seeing the account of substance, and later we'll talk about our knowledge of the external world at all as another issue, there is at least a sense of paradox in the view that Locke elaborates here. Because we get all our knowledge through experience, that sounds great, but then the most basic features of what it is we're experiencing, the substance of the world, the things that we experience, somehow remain hidden from us because we can't experience the things that have all the qualities that we come to know. We can only know the qualities that things have and not the thing itself. And so there is a kind of paradoxical account here of the relation of knowledge to the world, what we're seeing is that it's the empiricism that leads there, and later empiricist thinkers like Berkeley and Hume more explicitly draw conclusions from the empiricism that are surprising. In Berkeley's case, the view that there is no material substance, that when we know things, we're not knowing any separate material substance apart from thinking substance. And for Hume has a kind of skepticism as well, in his case focused more on causality, which is a central concept in nature. So we're not going to get on this semester to talking about Berkeley and Hume, but this discussion of Locke in this video, as well as the last video we'll be doing, we'll be touching on these potential problems that arise because of that empiricist approach to knowledge that by itself seems so commonsensical, obvious, and so forth. And so by looking at these paradoxical views that arise from empiricism, it maybe puts the empiricism in a new light and allows us to see maybe what was attractive about the rationalist view, even if ultimately we also see the problems in the rationalist view. So the first place that Locke mentions this concept of substance is back in Book 1 in his discussion of this whole doctrine of innate ideas and his attack on nativism. So he says there back in chapter 4 of Book 1 that the idea of substance in general cannot be acquired. Right? How would it be acquired? Well, it would have to be either through sensation or through reflection. Those are the only two sources of knowledge. And here Locke is acknowledging that the idea of substance, which we've seen, this philosophical idea of a substance, can't be acquired in any way. And as he's going to go on to argue later, we still need to talk about substances. We still need this concept. So we should be provided with this idea innately if any idea is going to be provided innately. So it looks like a good candidate for an innate idea, because it doesn't seem like we could ever see a substance. We can't see the substance itself. And I think, Descartes' example of the piece of wax is a good reminder of this. And Locke doesn't mention this example, but through the senses themselves, all we see is the different surface qualities of things. Now, Descartes said we need the intellect to sort of penetrate the object and know the object as a substance, right? Rather than just as the sort of covering, the hat and coat that covers the substances underneath. So it seems like this would be a concept that if God was going to give us a bunch of innate ideas, then surely he would give us this idea. And Descartes thinks so, and Descartes thinks we have this clear idea of substance. But Locke counters. He says we just don't have a clear idea of substance at all. Using his historical method, which is to say a method of observation and experience, Locke says, think about what you are talking about when you use the word substance. What idea do you have of that? He claims this word substance signifies nothing more than, as he says here, an uncertain supposition of we know not what. That's the substratum or support of the ideas we do know. So again, think of the wax example from Descartes. What do we know? Well, we know what comes in through the senses. We have a clear idea of the different sensory qualities, and Locke is certainly going to agree with Descartes that we have ideas of the primary qualities that are really in the thing as well. But here Locke is saying there aren't just the ideas kind of floating around or the qualities floating around. There has to be some underlying substratum that supports the ideas we do know. So there's something important here that escapes our knowledge. We're ignorant of that, and Locke doesn't shy away from that conclusion. Part of what he embraces with the empiricist view of knowledge and the power of the understanding that he's articulating in the essay is that there is a limit to what we can know. And we'll see later when he talks about thinking substance and corporeal substance that he's going to utilize this ignorance for a kind of positive conclusion in philosophy. Okay, so then when we turn to Book 2, moving away from his attack on innatism or nativism, his attack on the idea that maybe we have an innate concept of substance, he then introduces the different kinds of complex ideas we have, including substances. So even though there's something that we don't know, he says that we just have this unclear idea of something we know not what that supports the qualities, the modes that we do know. He makes clear that he thinks that we do have true complex ideas of substances. And here I've put this term substances in the sort of English, old English font to visually highlight the fact that for Locke, these are kind of down-to-earth things, not the philosophical Latin term substance, substantia, but the ordinary everyday things. These are some of the examples that he talks about. A human being, a horse, gold, water, a diamond, the sun, a magnet, or lodestone as he calls it, right? These are all substances. We have complex ideas of these things, and there's no skepticism about our ability to know those things for Locke. He says, again, this is in section 6 here of chapter 12, the ideas of substances are combinations of simple ideas as are taken to represent distinct particular things subsisting by themselves, in which the supposed or confused idea of substance, such as it is always the first and chief. And here again I've put in this Roman font the term substance. They're all in the same font in the text, but I put this in the singular here in the Roman font just to highlight that Locke has a different attitude about our ideas of substances, which are built out of whatever different simple ideas we have and the powers that those things have. Those are ideas of a man or a horse and so forth. And then this confused idea of substance, which philosophers talk about. So it's not until a bit later in Book 2, in chapter 23, that Locke gives a fuller account of substances and how we get our complex ideas of them, and how all of that relates to this philosophical concept of substance, and whether we need it, and what kind of knowledge we do or don't have of what substance itself is. So his account is something like this. We have ideas of qualities and powers. If we look out on the field, we might see something brown that's moving, that can eat and has motion that we can observe. The gold has a certain color, and when we pick it up, it has a certain weight, and it feels a certain way. All of these ways that things look and feel and so forth are the qualities, and then they also have powers as well. So that's what we have ideas of. And so then Locke, in the beginning of chapter 23, says that we notice that a certain number of these simple ideas constantly go together. So think about this from this strictly empiricist point of view. Again, I think the example from Descartes and the piece of wax is helpful here. What do you actually see? You see certain qualities and powers. Here he just says the simple ideas, but you see them together. When you look over in the direction of what we call the horse, you see all the qualities of the horse together at the same time. That's what you literally see. You don't see the underlying cause of the unity of all of those different causes that you do literally see. And as we go through life and experience things, right, the different qualities are organized in a certain way. They're not randomly patches of brown here and there, and there isn't a smooth feeling that isn't associated with other things. Instead, there's a certain orderliness to our observations, certain simple ideas we have together with other simple ideas. When we're looking at the sun or near the sun, we are having the idea of the heat and the light, and they are constantly going together. And when we're near the water, it's the reflection and the feeling of wetness, and so forth. In the case of the human being, it's the fact that there's a thinking and reasoning that's going on alongside the having of a body, and so forth. So the empiricist approach here is to say what we literally see are the simple ideas, and then also powers we'll see later, and we see that there are certain patterns there, that certain things go together. But, Locke says, we can't use language and communicate with each other and get by in the world in a society if we don't talk about all those ideas that seem to go together all the time as a single thing and give a single name to those things. As he says, communication requires us to give a single name to that constant complication of many ideas together. So in other words, here he's saying what we literally have confronting us in experience is not anything singular, but rather a collection of ideas that are over different experiences coming together at the same time. But that's too complicated to deal with, so we give a single name to all those things that tend to come together, all the different qualities that come together, and one time we call the sun, or a diamond, or water, or what have you. And Locke adds that we accustom ourselves to suppose a substratum. In other words, because every time we see the sun, we also feel the heat, or we see how it acts on other bodies like melting the wax and so forth. Because all of those ideas that are literally coming through experience come together, we develop a kind of habit or custom of thinking of all those things as themselves coming from an underlying source or substratum that's supporting all of those different ideas and powers. And Locke thinks of this process of forming ideas about substances as not having anything to do with philosophical thinking at all, or about coming to some kind of philosophical understanding of the nature of substance. Rather, it's an ordinary thing, and the ordinary person has just as good an idea of substance as the philosopher. As he says here, it is the ordinary qualities observable in iron or a diamond put together that make the true complex idea of those substances, which a smith or a jeweler commonly knows better than a philosopher, who, the philosopher, has no other idea of those substances than what is framed by a collection of those simple ideas they are made up of. So what is it to have the idea of a diamond? It's to have the idea of the hardness and the transparency and the way it refracts light and all of those things. It's the putting together of those ideas. It's giving a single name, diamond, to say there's something or other that has all those qualities. And if you have to have the idea of the diamond, is to have all of those different ideas joined together. And the philosopher who talks about substance, Descartes and the ancient philosophers too, Locke is saying they don't have any greater idea of substance than the jeweler who knows about the different qualities of the diamond. That's what really makes up the true complex idea of the substance. Whereas this thought about the underlying thing that supports all those qualities, that is just this confused idea of something I don't know what it is, as Locke says. So one example here Locke gives is that of a swan. So he says, thus, the idea which an Englishman has of a swan is white color, long neck, red beak, black legs, and whole feet, and all of these a certain size with the power of swimming in the water and making a certain noise. So these are the different ideas I have when I see a swan, although we could give a similar analysis of some of these, like neck and beak and so forth. But the basic thought is that I have all these ideas. When I have them all at the same time, and because I have these ideas coming together repeatedly, I give a name, or Englishmen give a name to whatever it is that has all of those qualities that I can experience. The secondary qualities of things are going to be accounted for by the underlying primary qualities. The color, we spoke about this already, those are going to be powers to cause the idea of white and so forth in us, powers that are explained by the primary qualities. But then the question is, okay, if I have this idea that is the idea of something with all of these different qualities, how can we talk about what it is that has the primary qualities? What's the support for the primary qualities? That's where this confused idea of substance comes in. And in a little bit of a digression, Locke returns to a discussion of primary versus secondary versus tertiary qualities in the context of trying to make sense of how they are all related and how they are all rooted ultimately in substance. So he says, our ideas of substances, he's spoken so far about simple ideas, but our ideas of substances are largely ideas of powers. So if we think about the sun, Locke says the secondary qualities of the sun, the heat that we feel, the color we experience, those secondary qualities. And also the tertiary qualities are the bare powers of the sun. Locke's example here is the sun has the power to turn wax white, to blanch the wax. That's a power of the sun. And so that's one of the things that makes up our idea of this substance called the sun. We consider it a thing. We give this name to it, sun. And Locke says, the heat, which we cannot leave out of our ideas of the sun, is no more really in the sun than the white color it introduces into the wax. These are both equally powers in the sun, operating by the motion and figure of its sensible parts, so on a man as to make him have the idea of heat, and so on a wax as to make it capable to produce in a man the idea of white. And in this context, in the next section, he also has a nice example of what he's talking about with the secondary qualities. He says, blood to the naked eye appears all red, but by a good microscope, wherein its lesser parts appear, shows only some few globules of red swimming in a pellucid liquor. And how these red globules would appear if glasses could be found that could yet magnify them 1,000 or 10,000 times more is uncertain, right? And so here he's saying, this is how our ideas of color work. If something looks to be uniform red and we have an idea that is of a uniform mass of red, but with a microscope you get closer, you see that there are only little globules, he says here, of red blood cells he's talking about. And so Locke introduced this thought about microscopic vision. What would it mean to see things as a microscope does compared to what our normal human vision is like? Normal human vision, we see not the microscopic texture, we see a color that is the result of the microscopic texture, or it is a power that is based in that microscopic texture. But he's trying to draw that distinction between the color that we see and the microscopic texture that is insensible or imperceptible to us. So, and in this context, he also raises this thought about what if we were to have eyes that were microscopical, he says. He raises this question about, why wouldn't we be given these eyes? It seems like we're missing out on understanding nature. And part of Locke's answer here is that, well, there are going to be maybe costs and benefits to seeing things with microscopical eyes. We would only maybe see small parts of something. We couldn't see a broader overview. In the case of colors, from a very great distance, we can maybe learn something about what we can see without needing to have microscopical eyes. We can see if if there is blood from a distance without examining the texture and so forth. We can see if a certain kind of fruit is ripe or not from a distance. That reveals something about the nature of the fruit and whether it's edible. and that is in turn rooted in the structure of the surface of the fruit and so forth. So there's some benefit to the fact that we have this ability to see colors, which even though they don't resemble things, the colors don't resemble the real things, nevertheless it may be of benefit to us to see things that way rather than with these microscopical eyes. Locke says, well, he maybe wouldn't, if someone were to get these eyes, he wouldn't make any great advantage by the change. He gives this example, if you had super hearing, it would maybe everything would be too loud for you and so forth. But his main point is that there are going to be these kind of costs and, both benefits and costs to having a form of perception that didn't involve secondary qualities. And he gives the example of a clock. And he's thinking, well, if you have normal vision, you can read the time. Because of the secondary qualities, you can distinguish the hands from the background. From a distance, you can look at the hands, it's 10:10. But if you had the microscopical eyes, you could see the gears and all the details of the gears, but you would find it difficult to get the broader overview that would allow you to actually read the time. So here, and this is just a close-up of the same image, obviously, but it's still a black and white image is still, the secondary qualities. What is it about the texture that reflects light? That's the only thing that you would be able to see if you had the microscopical eyes. Just the texture, not even the black and white. So then, to return to the main topic of the need for the idea of substance, Locke tells us that the substance, the fact that there is a substance, accounts for the unity of the qualities. So we need something more than just to have the idea of the heat of the sun, the color of the sun, and to say that those are constantly coming together. We need to be able to say that there's something underlying those qualities that unifies them. He says that the idea of a substance is the idea of several combinations of simple ideas coexisting in such, though unknown, cause of their union as makes the whole subsist of itself. So what is this underlying substance? It's unknown. It's hidden from us in some way, but it causes. It's still this kind of explanatory principle that accounts for the fact that the heat and the color of the sun go together. The color and the power of the horse go together, and so forth. So Locke talks about substances, and when he introduced the claim that we have complex ideas of substances, he said that this obscure idea of substance is the chief idea that's involved in all of the ideas of the particular substances. So we need this idea in some way, but how do we get it? Right? He also said we can't acquire it through sense and reflection, or sense or reflection, either of those, and it's not innate. So what is this idea? Where does it come from? If our ideas are all ideas of the various qualities and powers of things, then how do we get the idea of the thing that has those qualities? Or how do we get the idea of thing at all? That's distinguished from having an idea of heat, light, and so forth. So in a way, Locke says we don't really have the idea. Locke's not completely clear on this point, I think. Sometimes he seems to say that we have this confused idea, or he does say we have a confused idea, but he also says that we suppose that there's such a thing as a substance underlying the qualities. He says, thus, if anyone will examine himself concerning his notion of pure substance in general, he will find he has no other idea of it at all, but only a supposition of he knows not what support of such qualities which are capable of producing simple ideas in us, which are commonly called accidents. So he has this substance-accident distinction that we saw in Descartes and Spinoza, or substance mode. Spinoza prefers the term mode. But what is it that's this idea of substance that goes along with all of the ideas we have of particular substances? This idea of pure substance in general doesn't seem that we have any idea of it. How could we? And so this is the kind of paradoxical conclusion of the empiricism that Locke champions. So what Locke is particularly concerned to argue against is this view like Descartes, that we have this clear and distinct idea of substance, that maybe we know substance better than what comes to us through experience. And I think this is the context to understand this comment that he makes. Well, he first makes a comment like this in chapter 13, and then he comes back to this image in chapter 23, the main chapter on substance, where he compares this philosophical concept of, as he says, European philosophers of substance to the tortoise that supports the earth of, as he says, an Indian philosopher. So it hardly needs saying that Locke doesn't really know anything about Indian philosophy, and this is a distortion of anything like what the main currents of philosophy in India are. Nevertheless, there's a grain of truth in this story. It comes out of the religious traditions in India. But regardless of how accurately this depicts what some Indians maybe said about the support for the earth, it provides a nice image for what Locke's view of substance and the problems with thinking we know about the support for things brings. And so if we bring up the text in chapter 23, section 2 here on page 283, right? So that if anyone will examine himself concerning his notion of pure substance in general, he will find that he has no other idea of it at all, but only a supposition of he knows not what support of such qualities, which are capable of producing simple ideas in us, which qualities are commonly called accidents. If anyone should be asked, what is the subject wherein color or weight inheres, he would have nothing to say but the solid extended parts. That is, the secondary qualities are reduced to the primary qualities. Continuing, and if he were demanded what is it that solidity and extension adhere in, he would not be in a much better case than the Indian before mentioned, who, saying that the world was supported by a great elephant, was asked what the elephant rested on, to which his answer was a great tortoise. But being again pressed to know what gave support to the broad-backed tortoise, replied something he knew not what. And thus here, as in all other cases where we use words without having clear and distinct ideas, we talk like children, who, being questioned what such a thing is which they know not, readily give this satisfactory answer, that it is something, which in truth signifies no more when so used either by children or men, but that they know not what, and that the thing they pretend to know and talk of is what they have no distinct idea of at all, and so are perfectly ignorant of it, and in the dark. The idea then we have, to which we give the general name substance, being nothing but the supposed but unknown support of those qualities we find existing, which we imagine cannot subsist sine re substante, without something to support them, we call that support substantia. Again, using the Latin here to indicate that we're talking about this philosophical answer to this question, right? And so Locke is saying that when philosophers use this word substantia in Latin, or talk about substances, they are just giving a name to something that they don't know what it is. Locke is also ignorant about what the nature of substance is, but he is honest about it, he thinks. He thinks that other philosophers kind of pretend to know what they're talking about just by using this word substance. And that's the analogy, he thinks, with this tortoise, right? Or that there's just something that supports all of the different qualities that we do experience. And so he concludes this section by pointing out, well, the philosophers use this Latin word substantia, but bringing things back down to earth and using English, we call that support substantia in Latin, which, according to the true import of the word, is, in plain English, standing under or upholding. So, as Locke already said in the chapter 13 discussion of substance, the European philosopher doesn't have the tortoise maybe, but he has instead this word substance. So in a sense he's saying that the philosophers are giving some kind of magical powers to words, and maybe we're deceived, especially because they're Latin words. We're apt to take words for things, Locke says, and feign knowledge where we have none by making a noise with sounds. And the Latin terms here disguise our ignorance. So the accidents or modes inhere in substance, as the philosophers say. Inherentia is this ability to be in the substance, and Locke says when we talk about inherentia, in plain English that just means a sticking on, and the substantia, a literal translation would be an underpropping or a standing under or an upholding. And so Locke thinks by reminding us of these English meanings for the philosophical terms substance and inherence, we help cure ourselves of this illusion that we're saying something profound and meaningful with these terms substance and accidents. And especially we correct the thought of Descartes and others that we have clear and distinct idea of substance. Okay, so this is an unusual account of substance, and Locke certainly stresses the fact that we don't have a clear idea of pure substance in general. He says it's this something we know not what, and this has led commentators to wonder what Locke thinks about substances. Are then substances merely imaginary? And this is an objection made by Edward Stillingfleet, who at the time was the Bishop of Worcester, and in the footnotes in our addition to section 1 and section 2 here of chapter 23, we see his objection. He says, Locke makes substance merely imaginary, and hence banishes substances from the world. And you can see why Stillingfleet would say this. What we really experience is just this constant conjunction of different ideas. We can't have a direct experience that there's a thing that has or supports these different qualities that we have ideas of. Locke uses this language that we suppose or imagine that there's some support, and we can't get an experience of what it is. We just suppose that there's something that's unifying all these different qualities into something that we call the sun or a horse or a human being or what have you, and Locke compares the concept of substance to this tortoise, trying to present it in a ridiculous light. And this is going to be a problem for Locke. After all, if there are no substances in the world, then what is the human soul? What is the human being? What is God? God is a substance, and it's central to Catholic theology as well as Anglican theology, that you have to have some concept of a substance, and God is a substance, and the Son is part of the same substance, and there's a trinity of three persons in one substance. So if Locke is skeptical about the very existence of substances, all we know and all we can say for sure exists are the qualities. Locke is going to get in trouble with people like this Anglican Bishop of Worcester, Edward Stillingfleet, not to mention the Christian world more generally, but also just this common sense idea that how can you have just these patterns of qualities that you can find in the world rather than substances that are things that have those qualities and that account for why it is that we experience these qualities in an orderly fashion. And in the same note, the editors put Locke's response in letters to Stillingfleet. Locke's insistent, no, I think substances are real. Look through the essay. I say it 1,000,000 times. Humans exist. Those are substances. The diamond and water and iron. I said, and I've given all these different examples where I'm saying substances exist. Locke says, I am not saying there are these qualities floating around. I'm saying we have these names of substances. We get true complex ideas of substances. There are corporeal substances. There are thinking substances. God is a substance. I say something about all this. So that's his first point of response, that he actually says substances exist. As he says in response to Stillingfleet, I ground not the being, that is the existence, I ground not the being, but the idea of substance on our accustoming ourselves to suppose some substratum. So here Locke is just making the point, yes, I said that we don't have this experiential access to the concept of substance, and I said that we just accustom ourselves to considering different complications or collections of qualities as belonging together, and we simply suppose there's something that holds all those qualities together, and we call that a substance. But that just means that our idea of substance is based on this kind of custom or habit or supposition. It doesn't mean that substance doesn't actually exist. Furthermore, Locke adds, all sensible qualities carry with them a supposition of a substratum. So he wants to say, well, just thinking about qualities, if you think about a quality, you're kind of already thinking about there's something that has that quality. And he also insists, this is partly my way of putting it, but Locke insists, we do have the idea of something like the fact of the support, but what we don't have is the idea of the secret and abstract nature of the support that substance provides. How is it that there's something that holds all the qualities together, all the primary qualities together in one thing? So all of this is Locke's response to the worry that this empiricist account of substances, or substance in general, leads to a kind of paradoxical view of substance. That it seems like, well, maybe there are no substances. He insists there are. He was only talking about our lack of access to the idea of substance. And I don't want to dwell more on this point. However, I hope you can think through some of these points Locke is making here and ask the question, given his empiricist starting point and his conception of where our knowledge actually comes from, is Locke actually entitled to hold on to this thought about that he's accepting the existence of substance, even though he can't give an account of where the idea comes from? Is he entitled to say we have coming to us the simple ideas of sensation and reflection, and somehow when we get the idea of equality, we just already have the supposition of some kind of substratum for that quality? Can he accommodate those points within the empiricist framework? The rationalist is going to say he can't. The rationalist is going to say he's assuming that there's some way to know about the existence of substances that goes beyond any empirical sources or evidence. Okay, so there are just a couple more points I want to make about this idea of substance. So what he certainly does want to acknowledge is that we have no clear idea of substance in general. We suppose it. Do we have any idea of it? Is maybe a matter of debate. But Locke thinks that our lack of understanding of how a corporeal substance, a piece of iron, how it is that the extension of it holds together and the parts of it hold together, he thinks our lack of knowledge of that has a benefit when it comes to thinking about thinking substance. And in general, Locke says in these sections, it's wrong to single out thinking substance, or spirit, as Locke says, for skepticism. So people like Thomas Hobbes said there's no separate immaterial spirit, and we should understand everything in material terms or physical terms. Locke disagrees. He thinks we can talk about immaterial substance, immaterial thinking substance, or spirit, and his defense here is this kind of negative one, saying, yes, it's true, we don't have a clear idea of how spirit operates, how thinking substance operates, where thoughts comes from, and so forth, but we have no more clear idea about bodily or corporeal substance. So if we're going to doubt one, we have to doubt the others. As he says, for our idea of substance is equally obscure, or none at all, in both. And Locke even says that the mind is known better than the body, in a passage that recalls what we've seen in Descartes. And so this might seem like a surprising conclusion for the empiricist, but for Descartes, his empiricism is what allows to hold on to the thought that we're allowed to talk about immaterial substances that are distinct from body, and not in the way that Spinoza did even, because of the fact that since we don't have any clear idea of substance in the case of body, there's nothing particularly mysterious about spirit. And Locke says, speaking of someone who might think that, well, we can know about bodily substance but not spirit or thinking substance, Locke says here, it is for want or lack of reflection that we are apt to think that our senses show us nothing but material things. Every act of sensation, when duly considered, gives us an equal view of both parts of nature, the corporeal and spiritual. For whilst I know by seeing or hearing, etc., that there is some corporeal being without me, the object of that sensation, I do more certainly know that there is some spiritual being within me that sees and hears. This, I must be convinced, cannot be the action of bare insensible matter, nor ever could be without an immaterial thinking being. So this passage, I think, reminds us of Descartes, this thought that if I'm having a seeing or hearing, then I know even more certainly that I am a thinking thing. And so despite all the differences in his disagreements with Descartes, he accepts, like Descartes, that there is a thinking substance, and that in some sense he knows that substance even better than the corporeal substances. However, he also thinks he knows both much less than Descartes thinks we can. And the last main topic in the chapter on our ideas of substances is the idea of God. And I mentioned before that in this Christian context, any account of substance is going to have to account for God as the infinite substance. And that is in fact what Locke does. And I'll just go over this very briefly since this lecture's already gone on a long time. But the main point is that God, the infinite substance, our idea of him, also comes from experience. And unlike in the case of substance, where he says we don't have an adequate idea of substance itself, Locke thinks that we do have a positive idea of God as a substance, just like we have true ideas of the complex ideas of diamonds or gold and so forth. We have an idea of God that we can get from experience. So he has a duration, a power, knowledge, right? But he has all of those in an infinite way. So Locke sees that we enlarge the ideas that we acquire through experience, attach the idea of infinity to those ideas, and that's how we get the idea of God. So it's an empiricist account of the idea of God, where again, he's not saying we directly perceive God, but rather that we form the idea of God from finite ideas of power, knowledge, and so forth, combined with the thought of infinity, and that's where we get the idea of God. And this is separate from the evidence or proof we have for the existence of God that Locke talks about elsewhere. Here he's just saying, how is it that we can have this idea of God, and the origin is empirical.